Good day, everyone. I'm Gabriel Balmaceda, and I'm joined here today with Angelo Lesaca. Today, we have some interesting topics to cover on world history, especially for our country during the time of World War II. We will share our insights and reflections from some chapters that Renato Constantino narrated in his book, A Continuing Past. Today, we will cover the different perspectives of the two occupants, the Americans and the Japanese. We will show what they've experienced during the war and what our ancestors have experienced. We hope you will listen intently to our summarization and reflection on how our country faced hardships during this time. After World War II, Japan, who conquered the Philippines, lost the battle against the Soviet Union, leading to the submission and retreat of the Japanese forces. However, not so long after, the Japanese came back to the Philippines with different intentions. Their intention was to provide an economic boost through the use of Japanese products, therefore creating and developing Japanese-intended infrastructures or tourist spots in the country. At first, this created good intentions for the country as economic statuses were quickly rising after World War II. With the continuous flow of the so-called economic boosting in the Philippines, many Filipinos have forgotten or have disregarded the history that the country has with the Japanese colonial forces, as they were indulged and distracted with the sudden rise in economic power. This has then created a new image for the Japanese people, from colonizers to economic businessmen. Subsequently, as they have changed roles in society, Japanese people have then focused their roles to supply demands in the economy. Furthermore, this activity of economic boosting is said to be a technique that the Japanese corporations use to acquire materialistic resources that are commonly found in the Philippines. So, colonization, in a sense of dominating the economic status of the country, was prevalent rather than the use of violence and oppression as means of controlling the country. Despite of what the Japanese are currently doing for the country or the economic boosting, this should not hinder our nationalistic view. Even though we have been experiencing a life of peace and integrity, forgetting the past actions of the Japanese people or their acts of colonization is something that will lead to our demise. As forgetting the past may make it happen again. Therefore, Filipinos must learn and understand the events that took place before the Japanese changed their images and roles, as this would aid in knowing the future plans of our past colonizers. Despite World War II ending with the Japanese and the other colonial forces, Japan was said to be the lone country that was late in terms of changing their role in society, in a way that their country was the last to have themselves involved in economic businesses around the globe. Furthermore, with the expansion of the Japanese economic force, the rise of military power was prevalent as this had a major impact in the fast progression of various imperialistic objectives. Militarism has then aided the expansion in terms of economy and wealth in both Japan and its people. The Meiji Restoration, with the aid of the leaders, had successfully transformed the economy into a capitalist one while retaining the old feudal families. These families have become financial moguls using their wealth in multiple areas such as banks, estates, and stocks. Along with a strong basis for finances, they realized that they needed a strong military in order to maintain this economy. The military has then gained a new objective. Alongside their goal of territorial expansion, they would also need a replenishment and upgrade of arms and ammunition industries and providers in order to chase off their imperialists and have their goals succeed. Subsequently, the economy in Japan had an observable downward slope in terms of wealth and stock of materials and resources. This has then created a dilemma for the Japanese forces as they were unconsciously focusing on exporting native produce and products around the globe, while avoiding and disregarding the importing of products. The increase in exportation and decrease in importation has forced corporations and manufacturers to solely focus on exporting products as this was a better and steady way for Japan to maintain its economy. Japan has initiated war in multiple neighboring countries such as China and Russia. With more and more territory owned, the growing empire gained a boost in industrialization. This boost also conjointly boosted their status as a capitalist state. which means they are achieving their goals as expansionists and a strong military force. Although they were very successful throughout their military endeavors, they were still considered as dependent imperialists. They still needed raw materials from their colonies and other imperialist nations, and this was made more difficult as these other imperialists would be busy with other affairs. The expansion program was led by the military, the state bureaucracy, and the Zaibatsu. The Zaibatsu was the combined group of the biggest businesses during that time and served as the backbone for financing. In an economic depression during the 1930s, these companies monopolized over the smaller businesses who were suffering from the crash. The state agreed to these actions as for a more concentrated money gain to be used for financing arms and supplies. This also maintained the aggressiveness of their militaristic style of business, and to achieve this, they resorted to severely exploitation, even to their own people, and negligence to their welfare and social services. Though Japan has been quite successful in expanding throughout her neighboring countries, their military struggled in trying to expand in the West. They decided on joining European forces in the war against the Allied powers, fueled by their ambition in expanding in Asia because their colonies were being threatened to be taken over by the Americans and British. Great Britain's military had already got a hold on Singapore and Hong Kong. These countries have suffered an economic restriction concerning their trade with Japan, which was imposed by the Americans. This in turn was the go signal for the Japanese to go on all out war on them. The Allied powers further restricted their trade of raw materials in Japan by making it harder for them to get the supplies they needed via a biased license system for American exports to the country. As time went on, their supplies dwindled as the powers had a more solid control of trading. Although they wanted to wage war, they could only wage war on them for a short while. They planned to do a surprise strike on the American fleet in Pearl Harbor in order to buy time for expanding in Southeast Asia. The attack on Pearl Harbor only resulted in the postponement of their partnership with the Americans as collaborative imperialists. Only when they surrendered was the time when they returned to that status. To add on, they were even planning on profiting from post-war negotiations with the Americans. As their imperialist bonds grew in order to avoid potential problems, specifically the Soviets, the Americans grew more in control over the Japanese. They slowly turned the Japanese economy into a world capitalist under their supervision. This included further controlling the Japanese and destabilizing their system by destroying the Zaibatsu. As a way to answer back, the Japanese decided into an aggressive takeover of East Asia. They took over the oppressors, the Americans, who were oppressing the colonies in that area. The colonies were shocked to how they saw that the current oppressors, the whites, were not fully invincible. These victories created a mindset of Asia for Asians, which sought to remove Western influence and let indigenous culture cultivate in the Asian countries. The Japanese then promised their colonies for mutual beneficial economic connections with them. The plan included three categories, such as Burma, the Philippines, and Anna Cambodia independence. Second is protection for Laos, Java, and the new state uniting Sumatra and Malaya. Last would be for Singapore, Penang, and Hong Kong to be Japanese colonies. Despite their promises of liberation in East Asia, their actual reason was to replace their previous colonizers and become the new masters of these colonies. These were all propaganda folly in order for Japan to transform their colonies into economic reserves for their imperialist goals. After seeing Japan's quick and magnitudinal level of victories, nationalist leaders were convinced that Japan was winning this war. These leaders were then forced to cooperate with the Japanese in hopes of gaining independence, even if that came with Japanese supervision and surveillance. The Japanese had a total lockdown on the activities going on within their colonies thanks to their police force. Nationalists, seeing this severity, used this as an opportunity to get along with the Japanese, but not to associate with them. This granted them some bile for their political activities with a lesser chance of getting caught. The Japanese also created large groups of mass organizations in each country they had control over. The Nationalists also used this as some extent in their favor, such as Sukarno from Indonesia, who had advocated a system like this for achieving unity. When the Japanese enforced this system, these organizations controlled the mobility of supplies for Japanese war's needs. This created a sense of unity within these nationalists, which they would eventually use against their returning colonizers. So, here's what I've finished for now. Let's let Angela to continue on this overview.
Thanks, Balma. So with that said, here's an overview of what happened in the Philippines and the Filipinos' experiences during the early parts of the Japanese martial law and rule. It is said that the Filipinos during this war have had unique experiences due to their special relationship with the Americans. There were inconsistencies with the Filipinos' hostility towards the Japanese and their loyalty to the Americans in comparison to the other invaded colonies. These invaded colonies hated the thought of being associated with us Americans, while it could be said that the Filipinos have embraced the American influence in culture. After Pearl Harbor, this became a solid proof for the Americans to stereotype the Japanese as evil and oppressive, and thus present it to the Filipinos in order to Americanize them. This American influence created a racial bias for Filipinos against fellow Asians. Reinforced by the trait brought about by the Spanish colonization era, Filipinos looked down on their fellow Asian neighbors and developed a sense of superiority over them being a colony of America. They saw that the Japanese were inferior colonialists and what they are doing as mere imitators of America. Even with religion being the only Christian nation in Asia, the Filipinos looked down on those who weren't Christian believers as inferior nations. As the Japanese grew more and more successful in overthrowing the Americans, General MacArthur desperately tried a beach defense scheme to retaliate against the military force. He said that he was sure that the Japanese were not going to attack as early as spring 1942, although the Japanese already had figured out his plan and timetable. Despite the failure caused by MacArthur's poor decision making, he still insisted on his own plans as defense against the Japanese. He tried everything as a last-ditch effort to bring supplies to Bataan, the base of operations, and thus insurmountable losses occurred. They ended up getting wiped out, many troops died, time ran out, and supplies had to be left or destroyed in order for the Japanese to not take hold of these important materials. Continuing on, even basic supplies and needs thinned out in terms of rations for the troops. Refugees had to share the depleting supplies with the soldiers, and over time the amount just lessened even more. It came to a point that the main priority was to forage for anything to consume and get by, rather than scouting for the Japanese. The suffering people felt betrayed as they were suffering from both starvation and the brunt of the Japanese attacks. On January 2, 1942, the Japanese forces entered Manila, as it has been declared an open city by MacArthur since December 26 of the last year, 1941. The Japanese came with the goal of saving the Filipinos from the oppression that the Americans caused them, and to create the Philippines for the Filipinos. This was in order for the Filipinos at the time to develop their own culture and create new bonds with the Asian countries. This in turn had to be done under the military's commands, and that they had to follow them. This includes supplying the military with the needs when they were needed and having control over the citizens' lives. Amidst the colonialism brought about by the Japanese, the U.S. Army forces in the Far East, or the USAF, located in Bataan at the time, felt dismayed as their oppressors advanced on. They were still hopeful for the return of the American backups that would supposedly turn the tide for them. As mentioned earlier, the USAF was the symbol of the unity between America and the Philippines, as they consisted of around 100,000 Filipinos and 20,000 American soldiers. This served as part of America's propaganda as they went hand in hand with the Filipinos, defying all odds. Even after grave losses, they still strengthened the Filipinos' loyalty to the Americans. Unfortunately, the supposed USAF being a symbol of Filipino-American unity did not show its true nature during this time. Instead of being a whole group, they were divided into two entities, which were the American and Filipino soldiers. The Filipinos were not treated properly as they received less allowance for food and salary compared to the American soldiers. Filipino casualty also amassed on a larger scale than the ones recorded by Americans. These casualties from Filipinos also recorded and showed that they died more to hunger and injuries than to fighting the Japanese force. Eventually, they became overwhelmed by the power of the Japanese invaders, and the fate of the depleted and crippled Yusuf army ended up with the surrender of Bataan in April 1942. After the fall of Bataan commenced the brutal death march. Japanese officers made the prisoners bear an even heavier burden through the forced march, as they already were suffering prior to this. Even more soldiers died due to sustaining hunger and injuries, aside from the brutalities and sadism brought about by these officers. As time went on with the Japanese now in more control over the country, the Filipinos lost their civil liberties as they lived under a military system even more oppressive and brutal. They still wished for the saving grace of the Americans, as they were unhappy with the Japanese occupation and their poor situation. Filipinos had to surrender themselves to the force, and that certain orders were made to ensure that the Japanese could successfully instill fear and impose discipline among the Filipinos. Those who did not follow would be punished depending on the gravity of their offense, which naturally would have meant execution. They also asked the Filipinos to surrender their weapons to ensure that they would not be at risk of retaliation and gunfights. Even hidden and loose weapons were part of this ordeal, as the Japanese would resort to different ways such as prizes in return for information and location of the weapons, supplies, and the suppliers. Curfew was also established in different province and city boundaries to ensure that there was no suspicious activity going on between these places. They had stations for officers to guard when people arrived or left in order to search for contraband or arms which could have been used against them. No one was deemed safe. No night was deemed safe. People were taken from their homes and arrested even if they did not commit any crimes. These reports only happened due to information from spies, meaning that the Japanese had control on everything happening even when the Filipinos did not know it. Even the executions were brutal, as seen in newspapers. The execution methods were brutal, such as death by decapitation. In order to maintain the fear, the military, no matter what position they were, was the personification of the terrifying power the Japanese envisioned. It was rumored that they even told the Filipinos that they had no rights and that they would be publicly humiliated if they had done something even remotely wrong. No matter how bad the treatment a Japanese soldier receives from their superiors, that is the treatment these soldiers reciprocate to the Filipinos. On a higher scale, this restrictive power imposed by the military paved the way for illegal activities among the higher ranked officers. They treated the prisoners they caught like the lowest fill, as they experienced different types of beatings and interrogations. Those who survived them can only look back at their experiences as worse than death. To further spread Japan's goal in the Philippines, they also took control over their media. All forms of press prior to the martial law were closed, and that only licensed and controlled ones can be distributed to the public for reading. Even radio stations had to be renewed under Japanese control to avoid foreign broadcasts. Whatever was read or listened to would be all for the propaganda of the Japanese war. These were used to disseminate their announcements, orders, and warnings, such as how the Japanese were the ones winning this war. They forced Filipino writers to create short stories glorifying the lifestyles of the Japanese in comparison to the Americans, without much success. Education was also used primarily to create a new mindset for the Filipinos, that they were part of the Oriental group of Asia, and to also abolish the mindset of reliance on the Western powers. They abolished prior material that was anti-Japanese or anti-Asian, and anything that had positive relations to the Americans or British. They had control over public schools, and they had private schools limited and under their control and permission for operation. In order to bridge the language barrier, Nippongo became a compulsory subject in schools. Unfortunately, unfortunately, this caused resistance among the Filipinos, as the amount of students enrolled lessened compared to the time pre-war. Even teachers were resistant to the idea of having them teach a system based on Japanese ideology, with them much more preferring to the prior system under the United States. In terms of religion, the Japanese sought to gain control over the church without provoking them. On January 14, 1942, the Japanese released a declaration to Christians in the Philippines, which stated that the Filipinos had freedom over their religion, but that the Japanese needed to use the churches to achieve that goal. This was in order to limit the influence the church had on social and educational aspects, and to redirect their purpose as a means to advance the Japanese objectives. The priests and Catholic religion also became more propaganda material for the Japanese. They abolished the religious instruction and practices in schools and required permits for marriages, and they also used this power in order for priests to persuade the Filipino people through their preachings that basically resistance against the Japanese was futile. These policies and severities by the Japanese had one ultimate goal, which was the economy. They needed it in order to take territory supplies from the Filipinos and other colonies to sustain Japan's war needs. Aside from that, they needed the economy to stabilize in order for basic necessities for the army. An example would be that Japan believed that it would be better for the Philippines to start growing and exporting cotton instead of sugar as a primary crop, as the sugar farms were planned and managed by the previously dead Americans. Another problem was gasoline, as a lot of it has been used by Japan for their war activities. Transport was restricted as the automobiles and gasoline used were confiscated, and as you have may guessed, controlled by the military. They even went as far as to salvaging somewhat usable ships used by the USAF that were sunk from Japanese bombs. Although these were all profusely enforced to somewhat fix the economy after the war, it just caused hyperinflation. The amount of war notes and money in circulation became too much for how little commodities have become, and it only became worse when America started their air raids in 1944. Filipinos would often hide the little money they had that was in Filipino peso value and would try to get rid of the Japanese money because of its rapidly deteriorating value. In order to try to avoid this from happening during that time, the Japanese threatened the Filipinos into joining associations that would provide them privileges for buying the controlled commodities for lower prices if they invested into the association using their money. All these were done in order for the country to become a neo-colony of Japan.
So, as you can see, our ancestors bore the brunt of being swindled and oppressed by the colonialists during that time. They were given false sense of hope multiple times in order to be taken over and have their lives chained by them. In order for our country, economy, and basic needs to be all taken away and thinned out for war activity, the Japanese used their monstrous power and army to oppress them. This shows how much we suffered and how much our ancestors unified themselves to bounce back after all these horrible events. We became independent and focused on unifying the nation in order to restore peace and order. Without the efforts made by them, we could still have been a colony of a bigger country up to this point.
Mr. Constantino really brought about the experiences of the Filipinos vividly and intricately explained all the events, changes, and all minor details that led to each major event in this course of time. We agree with the author's analysis as it has shown our experiences and mistakes during this time. Although today we have a rich culture, it still cannot be denied that we have taken a lot of influences from our previous colonizers. We've been engraved with a colonial mentality and bias for Western culture, as seen even during the events we discussed earlier. But none of our ancestors were at fault, as we've been a colony for almost around 400 years. The virtues and practices of other nations that have colonized us have been passed down and can still be seen today in many situations. This doesn't mean that we forgot our own culture, as all these events serve as a reminder to never forget who we are. Our ancestors died fighting for our country's independence, and that now that where we are living freely today, we must thank them for their contributions by never forgetting who we are. Proud Filipinos. So that's it, I guess, for now, and we hope you have enjoyed and learned something new in this analysis. And we hope you'll also never forget about who you are. Mabuhay!